I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 19.4, the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. Some of the key things we'll be taking a look at as we move forward into 19.4, as we look at how George Herbert Walker Bush, former Vice President of the United States for 8 years under Ronald Reagan, became president and the impact he's going to have on the country. Keep in mind that it's best to watch the video lesson on one device and have open the Google Doc with the focus questions on it so you can respond on your Chromebook. If you have a YouTube account and you can stream it on your TV or on your phone or another device, that would be great. All right, so when you look at the Bush administration, the United States was dealing with a change during this period of time as the United States and the world was dealing with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. We'll look at that a little more closely in a separate lesson moving forward. But the United States, kind of by the time in which the Persian Gulf War will break out, as we'll see as we move forward, the United States was really the sole power at that point in time in a post-Cold War world. So let's look at the background first here of President Bush. So he's got one of the strongest resumes, at least on paper, of any president in the history of our country. Even in terms of his own background, he was originally from the New England region or the Northeast, Massachusetts, born in Milton, Massachusetts. Had a lot of experience, even, I guess, getting to understand the way in which politics works. George Herbert Walker Bush's dad, Prescott Bush, was a senator for a long period of time from Connecticut. He was even discussed a few different times throughout the 1950s in terms of, and even into the 1960s, as a potential vice presidential running mate for some of the different Republican nominees throughout that period of time in history. So really the Bush family's got a long history of service to the country and being involved in politics. In terms of George Herbert Walker Bush's early life, he, at a very young age, he was one of the youngest pilots for the U.S. Air Force during World War II. He nearly died during World War II. His plane was shot down in the Pacific as he was shot down by the Japanese. And he was like on a life raft, and he was just drifting out in the Pacific. And had he drifted towards a Japanese-controlled island, it's very likely he would have been captured and killed. No American prisoners of war survived that island. Instead, he drifted a little bit away from the island, and an American submarine was in the area and rescued him. So really kind of a early turning point in world history and in American history. It was even just the direction that Bush's raft kind of drifted, because obviously, as you know, he's a long-time impact on our country as well as his son. Through the 1950s, he moved to Texas, served in the House of Representatives from Texas. He established his own oil company and was very successful in the oil industry. So he's got background in terms of building up a business, in terms of serving in Congress and the House of Reps. He's also the United States ambassador to the United Nations. So he had a extensive background in diplomatic relations and getting along with other countries and being involved in that way. In terms of security, he was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, which is our spy-related organization in our country. He served for 8 years as vice president of the United States with President Reagan. He, along with his vice presidential running mate, Dan Quayle, a relatively young senator, defeated Massachusetts Governor Mike Dukakis and his senior vice presidential running mate, Lloyd Bentsen, in a very difficult campaign. So a lot of people consider the Bush administration to be an extension of the Reagan administration, just the third term in some ways of Ronald Reagan's presidency. Reagan, of course, a very popular Republican president. And President Bush, who served alongside of President Reagan, obviously was able to, I guess, use some of those coattails or some of the success of Reagan and kind of translate that into his own successful run for the presidency. Early on in the Bush presidency, Bush sworn into the presidency after winning the 1988 election in January of 1989, and by May of 1989, he was dealing with a situation in Panama, his first international crisis. Guillermo Endara appeared to rightfully win a presidential election as the new president of Panama. However, the military dictator at the time, Manuel Noriega, annulled, meaning he declared the vote null and void, and continued to serve as the leader of the country. So basically, he was voted out of the leadership role in Panama, and he just refused to leave. Bush had to send in 12,000 American forces to capture Noriega. One of the biggest fears we had at the time was that if the United States did not help to stabilize Panama, one of the issues could turn out to be the closing of the Panama Canal, which obviously is a huge waterway of international importance, not just to the United States, but to the global economy. Endara assumed the presidency. Noriega was put on trial, and it ended up being the biggest deployment of American forces since the Vietnam War. You see, then Vice President Bush seated here. Manuel Noriega seated here. So in 1983, roughly 6 years prior to this, the United States was still trying to diplomatically deal with Noriega, even though he was a dictator at the time. Number 4, what happened in China in June 1989. That kind of shocked the world. The world watched in horror as troops crushed a protest. Over 100,000 Chinese demonstrators, many of whom were college-age students, were protesting in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. They rolled in the tanks, they opened fire, and we never really got an exact number of the people who were injured and killed. It's estimated in the thousands were killed and injured. And there was a famous incident during this period of time. It's a famous photo from this period of time. And before I give you my response here, kind of take a look at the photograph. You see this one individual here. And if you remember back to 9th grade world cultures, you may have actually looked at this same photo or even a video clip from this particular individual. He was nicknamed the Tank Man. And basically the tanks were rolling in, and temporarily they halted as this man here refused to move. The tank tried to go around him. The man stepped to the left. Tank tried to go to the right of the man stepped to the right. And for a period of time, he had like a standoff. So when you think about that photograph, this one man versus basically the Chinese military, it kind of represented the individual defiance against the Chinese government during this period of time in history. So obviously this is an infringement on the right to demonstrate and the individual freedoms and citizens in China. So a lot of people look to see what President Bush would do in reaction to the horrible stories coming out of China. It's also during a period of time here in the 1980s as well that cable TV is really becoming quite popular. And so the information is kind of in the 24-hour news cycle for the first time as well. So, of course, China is a very large and powerful country, so it's very difficult for the United States to definitively step in regard to China. So Bush decided against sanctions. He felt this would worsen the situation in China. He condemned the actions, but he moved towards greater cooperation with the Chinese government. Bush continued to put some pressure on China to improve their human rights record and treat their citizens a little bit more compassionately. But all in all, the United States was kind of a weak response from President Bush and the United States in regard to the actions in China. Now, of course, the president who gets the credit for the best relations with China, at least during this period of time in history, is President Nixon. Despite Nixon's failures as president, his ultimate resignation from the office of the presidency, Nixon had a little stronger foreign policy success in China than did Bush. Both presidents believed it was important to maintain an economic relationship with China despite their differences. However, Nixon did not have to deal with the human rights issues in China like the protests in Tiananmen Square. So really, Nixon was just in the very beginning stages of what was going on in China. So therefore, he dealt with more of the positives opposed to the negatives associated with China. Another area of concern for President Bush and the world community during this period of time is going to be in South Africa. South Africa, for a long period of time, had a two-tiered society in South Africa. And South Africa is literally the southernmost country in Africa, the continent of Africa. There's nearly 50 countries in Africa, and South Africa is at the very southernmost tip, Cape Town being the southernmost city in South Africa. The white elites had controlled the South African government for a long period of time, dating back to colonial periods of time in Africa. They implemented a very oppressive system of rigid segregation between black and white South Africans. Black South Africans had to live in segregated areas. They had to wear ID badges. So basically, the ID badges would be the equivalency of just listing out where they live, where they're permitted to go, what their job is, and without permission to be in a certain area, you could be potentially arrested. They were treated as second, or even you can probably even say third-class citizens, very much discriminated against. You can see on the left side there, this is very reflective of what we had looked at in America during the period of time into the 1960s, where you had Jim Crow laws or segregation laws throughout the South. You can see the sign on the right side there. Danger, natives, Indians, and coloreds. If you enter these premises at night, you'll be listed as missing. Armed guards shoot on sight. Savage dogs devour your corpse. You've been warned. So basically a direct threat to your safety for any violations. During this period of time, a person very similar to what we would say in our own country of a Martin Luther King figure in the United States or a Mohandas Gandhi figure in India. For South Africa, the person who emerged for South Africa was Nelson Mandela. Mandela established the African National Congress. This was a coordinated effort to protest against the apartheid system. Once again, the apartheid system is just simply, if you look at the root of the word, apart. It was the system of segregation in South Africa that kept the blacks and whites in South Africa separate or apart. So it was really Mandela who stepped up to try and find a way to end the horrific apartheid system in South Africa. And much like Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela spent actually more time in prison than even did Martin Luther King. So sometimes when you stand up for injustice and you stand up for what's right within society, it doesn't necessarily always work out well initially. There's a lot of self-sacrifice that is necessary to facilitate and bring about change, and that was certainly the case in Martin Luther King's case. In our country, Gandhi, who spent time in prison fighting for independence from Great Britain and for the Indian people, and Mandela here spent a tremendous amount of time in prison in South Africa. So President Bush in the United States attempted to put pressure on South Africa to end the apartheid system. A series of economic sanctions were placed in South Africa to try and strangle their economy and force them to change their harsh policy, the apartheid system in South Africa. Bush met with Mandela in 1990 to pledge his support for the anti-apartheid movement. And shortly thereafter, apartheid ended, and Mandela went full circle from being imprisoned and ostracized within the country by the majority. Eventually, he was elected president of South Africa in 1994. So a real hero, not just in South African history, but also in history in general. Next, moving on to Operation Restore Hope, is another situation ongoing on the continent of Africa. In 1992, President Bush authorized the deployment of American Marines in a joint United Nations effort in Somalia. Somalia is an African country located along the central east coast of Africa. So you can see here, it's in the red here on this. There's actually a patch that the United Nations troops wore on their uniforms. Basically, this is a joint effort. The United Nations, unlike the League of Nations, which we had studied earlier in the year, which did not have its own fighting force, the United Nations had its own fighting force, and countries from around the world would commit divisions of troops to help out in certain areas around the world. In the United States, Pakistan, I believe, was another country which had committed troops there to help out in a humanitarian effort to bring food to the starving Somalian people. The There was a warlord in Somalia that continually stole supplies and attempted to starve its people into submission. So what we did is we brought in food, medicine, and aid in hopes of literally restoring hopes to Somalia. Ultimately, this will be something that's not going to be fully settled until the Clinton administration, and we'll come back and look at that a little bit more as we get into the Clinton administration later on in the 1990s. 12, why did President Bush respond differently to the crisis in Somalia than in China? Well, China was a more important trading partner for the United States. Often the United States has its own self-interest in mind making their foreign policy decisions, so they did not want to jeopardize trade with China by being too proactive and helping out the citizens in China who were being killed in Tiananmen Square. Where in Somalia, not that we can necessarily bully, but we're not necessarily intimidated by the Somalian military, nor are we concerned about losing trade or anything like that. And that would go too with our negotiations with South Africa during the period of time of putting pressure on them to end apartheid. Additionally, the human rights issues in Somalia were a little bit more obvious in comparison to the issues in China. There was more evidence where we had to rely on news reports in China because of the closed society in China. Next, we're going to look at a very difficult situation. It's going to start basically a 15-year or longer period of time of American involvement indirectly or directly in Iraq. The longtime leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, pictured there at the top. He became very aggressive in August of 1990, and we'll look at a map in a moment. Hussein ordered his forces to invade a small Middle Eastern oil-producing country, Kuwait. And so I'll show you that on the map. So Iraq is one of the largest countries in this region. You have Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Those are kind of the three core large countries in the Middle East. And you have some secondary countries that are located in this region as well. Syria, obviously, we've seen a lot of incidents and sadness in Syria in recent years. Lebanon, Israel, of course, a center of controversy from the period of time after World War II through contemporary times. Jordan. And then you have a series of other secondary countries that you can't necessarily see here, like Oman, Yemen, Dubai. We have a lot of different ongoing issues in these particular areas. So Kuwait, very much a defenseless country, this small region here. So what Iraq did is it moved its troops into Kuwait and physically took control of it and basically annexed it. Now, Kuwait was pretty much defenseless, and you say, why would they go into Kuwait? Well, they have a lot of oil fields there, so despite its small size, Kuwait is very rich in oil and a very wealthy country on a per person or per square mile basis. Also, too, when you look at the Persian Gulf, that's how you get oil out of the Middle East. So having additional ports along the Persian Gulf would be very valuable to Iraq as well. Here's the capital in the center of Iraq, Baghdad. So the United States was very concerned, as was the rest of the world, because if we have a huge crisis in the Middle East, it could potentially impact the exportation of oil around the world and the world economy. This is also a period of time, too, in the early 1990s. The United States was not quite yet oil independent. We have enough oil production today in 2020 that we can function without any Middle Eastern oil whatsoever. So looking at 14, so the United States was afraid Iraq's actions would impact the world's oil supply, as I mentioned. Hussein, Iraq's dictator, would control then 20% of the world oil supply if the invasion was successful, and he maintained his control of Kuwait. The American economy could have been significantly impacted by a sudden shortage or clarkage of oil during this period of time. A sudden rise in prices would be dramatic and drastic in a negative fashion on our country. Also, too, there's a lot of rumors that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and ties to terrorism. Stories emerged out of Iraq that Hussein was paying suicide bombers upwards of $20,000 per suicide bomber to the loved one's family if they went into Israel and detonated an explosive device. So a lot of negative things in regard to Hussein and Iraq. So what President Bush did, instead of just reacting on his own in August of 1990, he first wanted to go to the world community, the United Nations, build an international community and support for an action in Iraq. Bush proposed international economic sanctions, basically cutting off trade with Iraq until they withdrew their troops from Kuwait. The United Nations passed a resolution demanding that Hussein leave Kuwait. So basically we had almost unanimous international and world support for Hussein to pull his troops out of Kuwait. The United States mobilized 700,000 troops in Saudi Arabia to protect it from a potential invasion from Iraq, because if the Iraqi government went into Kuwait, there's some fear that maybe Saudi Arabia would be next. How strong was the support for economic sanctions against Iraq? Nearly universal support from the United Nations and the world community. And what he did is he kind of drew a line in the sand. President Bush made a big speech, and he said that Saddam Hussein had to pull his troops out of Kuwait by January 15th, 1991. If not, he would face utter and prompt destruction. So now the support for military action in Iraq was not quite as strong as it was for economic sanctions, but he was able to get 28 countries who were willing to commit troops in a joint military effort against Iraq if Hussein refused to leave Kuwait. Even countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia were nations that were willing to commit troops to the war effort. So obviously this is a unique situation where you're kind of getting, countries that you would not necessarily naturally would think would be American allies were allies during this conflict. The military plan against Iraq was originally nicknamed Operation Desert Storm. Went on to be remembered as Gulf War I because we'll be involved in Gulf War II in the 2000s, shortly after September 11th attacks. One thing you say about President Bush, he was a man of his word. On January 16th, 1991, just one day after the deadline, American planes began bombing Iraqi military targets. Iraq countered by launching Scud missiles into Israel in an attempt to damage Israel. And the hope on the side of Iraq was that if Israel responded with attacks against Iraq, perhaps the American coalition would have crumbled in the Middle East, because the one thing that kind of unites Middle Eastern countries together is their dislike of Israel. Israel did not fire back, fearing the coalition would have disbanded over those countries' dislike for Israel. And the United States had communicated with Israel to be patient and that we would take care of Iraq as quickly as possible and protect them indirectly that way. The United States launched a massive ground assault, and despite having the fourth largest army in the world, that would be Iraq, the Iraqis' large army was no match for our forces. Shortly after our ground assault, Hussein agreed to a ceasefire, knowing that he could not defeat the United States and our coalition forces. One thing the United States did not do is we did not march to Baghdad. We did not go in there and remove Hussein from power. In retrospect, some people were a little bit concerned that we didn't do that. So when you look at the long-term impact of the Iraq war, some of the advantages of how President Bush handled the war: only 148 American deaths compared to over 25,000 Iraqi deaths. The war lasted less than a week, just 5 days. Bush was able to get support from the UN, troops from Britain, France, and other countries to support. However, because Hussein remained in power, he's going to be a thorn in the American side moving forward. And literally, it would not be until George Herbert Walker Bush's son came to power that we would finally remove Hussein from power. Hussein, as we're going to see as we move into the second Bush administration towards the end of the school year, we'll see how the second President Bush finished off Hussein. The Iraqi government found Hussein guilty of crimes against their country, and eventually Hussein's going to be executed by the Iraqi government. And then, of course, many Iraqis had mixed feelings towards the United States. Anytime the United States deploys troops in a foreign country, There are concerns as to whether or not the United States should really be there, and as whether or not they're there in our own self-interest or in the interest of the Native people. So all in all, we're really going to see a part 2 to the Gulf War before we actually see a definitive end. With that in mind, we're going to leave off here. And until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.